Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We've got a set of source material in front of us today that is, well, it's genuinely unique. It demands that we confront one of the world's most acute strategic crises, the militarization of the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant, or ZNPP, through the lens of our deepest theological convictions.
It does. The sources you've gathered here, they're a mix of highly technical documents on nuclear operational status and geopolitical analyses of wartime strategy. And they really force us into an uncomfortable but essential analysis.
Right.
We can't just look at ZNPP as a typical military problem. It's a case study of human action operating completely apart from divine guidance.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. It's an unusual one because it requires us to approach ZNPP through two crucial and seemingly disparate tracks. We need to dissect the cold, hard facts of geopolitical bargaining and leverage. And at the same time, we have to examine what this unprecedented crisis reveals about the human condition, specifically the doctrines of sin and sovereignty.
The central dilemma here, and it's one that has never confronted humanity before, is that a civil nuclear facility, a colossal piece of engineering meant to produce light and heat, has been intentionally converted into an active military fortress.
So it's not just occupied territory.
Not at all. It is the calculated weaponization of global catastrophe.
So we're not just analyzing the rules of war here. We're looking at how technology functions when it's severed from the moral restraint that comes from the creator. It just becomes an amplifier for destruction. So we'll start with that theological framework, reformed principles, informing our view of the fall and grace.
And then we'll pivot to the strategic analysis. We'll look at how danger itself is used as a diplomatic tool.
Okay.
And this is the great insight from the analysis. The plant's enormous inherent danger is what grants its strategic value. That political and military currency keeps increasing even when the facility is in cold shutdown and not generating a single kilowatt of electricity.
Because the threat is the commodity.
The threat is the commodity.
Okay, let's unpack this assessment. We'll start with the theological track, focusing on the nature of rebellion. The sources cite John Calvin's view of the sensus divinitatis. For listeners who might be encountering that term for the first time, how do we introduce that idea conversationally?
Well, the sensus divinitatis is simply the innate fundamental knowledge of a divine order. Calvin taught that God has planted this seed of religion, this sense of the divine in every human heart.
So it's something we're born with.
It is. We know at a core level that we're accountable to an ordered universe that's sustained by a wise and moral governor.
And what happens when a person or a whole nation approaches the brink of nuclear catastrophe? How does that innate sense respond?
The ZNPP crisis triggers what the analysis calls a primal existential dread. This is a fear much deeper than the fear of death from a bullet. It's the recognition of humanity's capacity for what the sources call uncreation.
Uncreation.
It's that terrifying realization that we have the technical means to completely undo the ordered physical complexity that God established in Genesis 1 and 2. We can take that 6-reactor plant, a marvel of human ingenuity, and turn the land around it into a radioactive wasteland for thousands of years.
And that violates the very intuition of order that God built into us.
It absolutely does.
So the thesis of this theological assessment is that the military brinkmanship isn't just political maneuvering. It is, at its root, a theological rebellion.
Precisely. It is the fallen creature attempting to hold the Creator's physical power, that immense energy bound within the atomic nucleus hostage for a temporal, immediate strategic gain. The strategy of weaponizing a reactor is a direct assault on the moral order.
A moral order which should govern how we interact with the physical world God made.
Yes.
That leads directly to the core mandate for human interaction with creation, which is the dominion mandate laid out in Genesis 1.28. The directive to harness and cultivate the earth for human flourishing and for God's glory.
And ZNPP, in its original purpose, was a pinnacle of that common grace ingenuity. You've got 6 VVER 1000 reactors, originally generating 6 gigawatts of electricity.
Which is a huge amount.
Huge. Before the occupation, it supplied nearly 1/5 of Ukraine's electricity. Light, warmth, energy for hospitals, for cities. That is stewardship. Taking the raw building blocks of matter and directing their energy toward life-sustaining outcomes. It's human ingenuity operating under God's general favor, striving for order.
But the occupation flips that entirely on its head. The sources define this inversion as the technocratic fall. What makes it technocratic rather than just a simple moral failing?
It's the coupling of total depravity with immense technical skill. The technocratic fall is this grotesque inversion of the dominion mandate, where the doctrine of total depravity The reality that sin corrupts every aspect of human existence, our intellect, our will, enables the catastrophe.
Yeah, so you have fallen men wielding this almost.
Godlike ability, unbinding the atom.
Yeah.
And they're doing it while simultaneously ignoring the fundamental moral laws that should govern that ability. The corruption is total. It affects both the aim, which is warfare, and the method, which is nuclear blackmail.
The analogy drawn in the material is the Tower of Babel in the atomic age.
That analogy fits perfectly. Babel was the hubris of technological prowess, the skill to build a tower reaching the heavens, decoupled entirely from ethical and moral restraint.
They were trying to make a name for themselves apart from God.
Right. And they used their technical skill for idolatrous ends. Similarly, using the binding energy of the atom to create a global radiological deterrent is the ultimate hubris. It says, we will use the laws of physics, which God sustains, to break the moral laws he established, and we will dare the world to stop us.
This frame makes the technical failures at ZNPP more than just maintenance issues. They become moral or theological incidents. The sources highlight the core vulnerability. The reactors, even in cold shutdown, require a constant, unbroken stream of electricity for cooling. Why is that specific fact so critical?
Even after a reactor is shut down, the process of radioactive decay continues, and it generates what's called residual heat. It is a critical amount of heat. If that heat isn't continuously removed by circulating cooling water, the temperature in the reactor vessel and the spent fuel pools starts to rise.
And if the water boils away?
Then the fuel can overheat, leading to a catastrophic failure of the containment system. And this isn't a brief process. It requires cooling for years. That's why electricity to run the cooling pumps is non-negotiable.
And that electricity supply has been anything but stable.
No, not at all. Since the occupation began, the plant has lost off-site power, that essential link to the stable external grid, at least a dozen times. Each time, the staff has to immediately switch to the emergency diesel generators.
And those generators are designed as the absolute, short-term, last line of defense against meltdown.
They are. They're not meant to be routine operational hardware.
Which brings us to the theological interpretation of this technical reality. It's viewed as a tempting of providence.
It is. If we look to the Westminster Confession of Faith, Chapter 5, Paragraph 2, it discusses God's providence operating through secondary causes, the intricately designed laws of physics, chemistry, thermodynamics that God sustains in every moment.
And the need for constant cooling water is one of these secondary causes.
It is. So to treat the continuous reliance on fragile, wartime vulnerable diesel generators, which require consistent fuel supply, maintenance, wartime access, as a routine operational standard is to hold those physical laws, and the one who ordains them, with utter disdain. It's institutionalized recklessness.
You're essentially gambling with the physical reality of God's sustaining hand.
Yes. Each time they lose the grid connection, they are rolling the dice. The resources detailing the plant's history mention the constant maintenance nightmares, ensuring fuel trucks can safely reach the site, dealing with generator failures under duress, and the constant stress on the human operators.
It's a thin margin of safety.
A very thin margin, secured only by the bravery of the staff. And this reliance signifies a moral detachment from the gravity of the potential consequence.
The sources drive home the imagery of decreation with another powerful and tragically specific example, the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam.
The dam's destruction was physically staggering, and its impact on ZNPP was immediate and critical. The Kakhovka Reservoir was the massive primary water source for the plant's cooling ponds and its systems.
So by destroying the dam,
By destroying the dam, a deliberate act of war returned a vast region of ordered, cultivated land, a highly functioning part of God's creation, back to chaos. It physically drained the lifeblood of the facility.
And what did that destruction force the plant operators to do, technically?
They had to immediately shift their operational paradigm. They began relying on on-site groundwater wells and a limited cooling pond capacity, which is now separated from the drained reservoir. This drastically reduced the margin of safety, making water availability a constant wartime vulnerability.
So this act, turning the water that provided order and cooling back into chaos, is cited as the clearest physical enactment of the reversal of the Genesis order.
It is. God brought order out of chaotic waters in Genesis, and this is man returning order to chaotic waters.
So the conclusion of this theological assessment is that technology is never neutral. It simply amplifies the moral posture of the human heart.
That's right. A nuclear reactor can be a tool of flourishing under the Dominion Mandate, or an engine of catastrophe under the Technocratic Fall. The greatest threat isn't the fission process itself. The greatest threat is the unchecked, total splitting of man's will from God's moral law.
And when that split happens?
Technology serves only the goal of self-exaltation and destruction.
Okay, if the first section addressed the rebellion against the creation mandate, our next step has to look at the specific moral violations governing human interaction, especially in a war. How does total depravity corrupt the logic of war itself, moving beyond the mere act of invasion?
Well, total depravity explains why the concept of a nuclear shield is even possible. The corruption of the will leads men to believe that the potential death of millions is an acceptable cost for minor territorial gain. This strategy immediately violates the classical Christian principles of justus in bello, the just conduct of war.
Let's look first at the principle of discrimination. This principle demands a clear distinction between military targets and civilian infrastructure.
The source material provides concrete evidence of this violation. Russian military trucks and armored vehicles have been observed parked inside the turbine halls, specifically those connected to Units 1 and 2.
They're deliberately blurring that line.
Completely. The turbine halls are right next to the reactor containment vessels. By placing military assets there, the occupier is trying to gain the protection offered by the nuclear facility itself, knowing the opponent can't risk striking those buildings.
So they're turning a structure designed for civilian use into a de facto military fortress.
And beyond that, the analysis points to the deployment of offensive weapons like Grad and Smerch rocket systems. These have been documented firing from positions immediately adjacent to the plant. This makes the plant a safe harbor for aggression.
So they're using the potential death of millions, the civilian population downwind, as a fortification to deter counter-battery fire.
Yes, this is a perversion of the civil magistrate's role. The sword, which Calvin said is ordained to protect the innocent, is turned into a shield for the one committing aggression.
This asymmetry takes us directly to the principle of proportionality. The argument here is that the risk of catastrophe massively outweighs any tactical advantage.
It is an utter failure of moral arithmetic. What's the tactical advantage gained by safely firing a few rockets from an adjacent field? It's a fleeting, localized benefit on a single front line.
And the cost?
What's the cost of a breach of containment? The cost is rendering vast regions, and potentially millions of lives and livelihoods, uninhabitable for centuries. To risk a multi-generational catastrophe for a temporary territorial advantage reveals a win-at-all-costs mentality. It just discards the concept of stewardship and the future of God's creation.
And finally, the occupation strategy warps the doctrine of double effect. If collateral damage is usually viewed as an unintended side effect of legitimate military action, something to be minimized, how is the ZNPP scenario different?
In traditional jus in bello, if you bomb a legitimate military factory and nearby civilian houses are damaged, that damage is an unintended, regrettable collateral effect.
Right.
At ZNPP, however, the risk of a radiological disaster is not unintended. It is the central, active mechanism of defense. The potential for disaster is actively curated, increased, and manipulated as a deterrent.
It's global blackmail.
That's it. They're using the threat of a safety accident as their strategic posture. International Humanitarian Law Article 56 of Additional Protocol I to the Geneva Conventions prohibits targeting these dangerous installations.
But the occupying power isn't just disregarding the law.
They're inverting the norm. They're using the protection granted by the law to facilitate their military action. The law says, do not touch this because it is dangerous. The occupier says, we will stand here because we are dangerous.
We've been dissecting hardware and law and strategy, but the crisis is perhaps most tragically understood through the lens of the staff, the actual nuclear operators. These are the bearers of the Imago Dei who hold a high vocation of stewardship over this immense atomic energy.
The moral weight they carry is unimaginable. The sources provide heartbreaking documentation of the evidence of coercion. Torture chambers, often referred to as the pit, established by the occupying forces on-site or nearby. Staff have been subjected to electric shocks, severe beatings, and mock executions.
Just calculated sadism aimed at breaking their will and forcing them to cooperate with the occupying authorities.
And the specific act of coercing technicians to sign contracts with Rosatom, the Russian state nuclear operator, is a major assault on their moral agency and conscience. This is more than administrative pressure. It's forcing them to betray their professional oath and their national allegiance.
The theological indictment is severe.
It is. Torture is a heinous blasphemy. It treats the Imago Dei, the living image of God in man, as a mere object to be manipulated, used, and discarded. As Calvin observed, to harm a neighbor is to strike at God's own image.
This connects directly back to our reformed theological standards regarding life and neighborly duty, like the Sixth Commandment.
The Westminster Larger Catechism in question 135 details the positive duties of the Sixth Commandment, which include comforting and protecting the innocent, and it forbids the opposite actions, striking, wounding, or oppressing.
The occupation mandates the exact opposite.
It does. And beyond that, the moral corruption creates a massive physical risk. Subjecting these nuclear operators to extreme stress, fear, sleep deprivation, and physical abuse dangerously increases their potential for human error.
And given the sheer scale of the facility, operator error isn't a local risk.
Not at all. Their fatigue, their duress, or a moment of compromised skill due to terror becomes a continental risk. This is a compound sin. A direct crime against the body and soul of the victim, coupled with reckless endangerment of the life of our neighbor on a massive scale. The resources highlight the extraordinary danger this imposed stress places on all of Europe.
Yet, despite this demonic pressure, they continue to show up and perform their technical duties. The sources view this persistence as a manifestation of heroic common grace.
It is vital that we see it that way. God, in his general mercy, is enabling these specific men and women image bearers under the most extreme duress to maintain the precise technical focus, the skill, and the calm required to prevent a planetary catastrophe.
They stand in the gap.
They do, between order and chaos, enduring a kind of vocational martyrdom. The fact that the lights stay on, that the water continues to circulate, and that they haven't suffered a full, unrecoverable meltdown is a direct function of God's restraining hand working through the integrity and skill of these individuals. It is common grace preventing general calamity.
We've looked at the failure of man's will, which created this internal moral crisis at ZNPP. Now let's turn to the failure of man's systems, particularly those established to manage the anarchy of nations. The sources suggest that ZNPP has brutally exposed the limits of secular attempts at common grace.
It really has. Institutions like the UN and the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, are examples of institutional common grace. They function as attempts to impose order on the anarchy of international relations, fulfilling the Westminster Confession's ordination of the civil magistrate, just on a global scale, to restrain evil.
And the IAEA has certainly been active. They've done commendable work trying to establish some form of technical and moral governance.
Their efforts are highly laudable. They established the 7 indispensable pillars for nuclear safety, and later the 5 concrete principles, which include strict rules like no heavy weapons at the site and no attacks launching from the site.
These protocols are based on natural law reasoning, right? They appeal to the universal instinct for self-preservation and the shared physical risk.
They do. They represent the best possible attempts to apply the Noahic covenant principle of preserving human life in the atomic age.
But the persistent violation of these principles, the continued presence of heavy weapons, the loss of power, demonstrates the insufficiency of these secular institutions. The failure, according to the sources, isn't a failure of diplomacy, it's a failure of anthropology.
That is the core argument. Secular international relations theory fundamentally relies on the premise that man is a rational actor. This theory assumes that leaders, when presented with clear risks and costs, like the fallout from nuclear accident, will rationally de-escalate and comply with established norms.
And reformed realism, informed by the doctrine of total depravity, offers a very different view.
A completely different view. Total depravity teaches that sin is irrational. It blinds the intellect and hardens the heart. Leaders pursue immediate territorial and political gain, even when the cost is existential risk to their own people or to the world. Power, divorced from moral law, becomes self-destructive.
This irrationality is what the sources call the manifestation of a reprobate mind.
And we see that irrationality played out in the technical details. The documented drone strikes near containment vessels, the snipers positioned in turbine halls, the intentional disregard for established power line safety. These actions are technically insane. They gamble with creation itself.
A rational actor would never risk the complete destruction of their own objective, the facility itself, for a temporary gain.
But a mind blinded by the pursuit of absolute power will.
And since the IAEA lacks the literal sword of a sovereign magistrate to enforce its decrees, it's just reduced to a helpless observer.
This perfectly illustrates the paralysis of global governance. The UN and its related agencies rely on the consensus and good faith of member states. But when one of the most powerful members, a permanent Security Council member, is the aggressor and actively occupying the plant, These institutions are neutralized by the very sin they seek to regulate.
They try to produce the fruits of peace without the root of the gospel?
Right. They rely on treaties and conventions, what the sources call parchment barriers,
And those are easily torn apart.
easily torn asunder by imperial ambition. The sources draw a clear parallel to the prophetic visions, like in Daniel 7, where imperial beasts crush established order. The ZNPP crisis serves as a powerful rebuke to the idol of global governance, which seeks to solve the problem of sin through human regulation alone.
So, while we support the IAEA's efforts as a good expression of God's preserving common grace, our confidence cannot rest in Geneva or New York.
We have to recognize the limit of human institutions. The instability at ZNPP proves that true, enduring restraint of nuclear chaos requires more than a resolution or a treaty. It requires the sovereign hand of God to actively restrain human evil.
Okay, shifting gears entirely, let's move from the theological assessment to the geopolitical analysis. The sources define the ZNPP scenario as the nuclear bargaining paradox. What is that?
The paradox is simple. The plant's strategic value in wartime is measured entirely in fear, leverage, and the potential political cost of catastrophe, not in its operational output.
So the fact that the plant is so consequential, too dangerous for anyone to strike, yet critical to national infrastructure, makes it an extremely useful asset to whoever controls the conditions around it.
Yes, it is powerful precisely because it's fragile.
And the most important facet of this paradox is that the plant doesn't even need to be generating power for this leverage to work. Why does ZNPP still matter so much, even when it's in cold shutdown?
This requires a clear technical understanding. Cold shutdown does not mean safe. Even when all 6 BVR 1000 reactors are shut down, the process of radioactive decay continues, producing a lot of residual heat. This heat has to be constantly managed.
And if that cooling water circulation stops,
The heat begins to build, and you can get fuel damage and massive releases.
how much time does the staff have once the pumps fail?
That time is highly variable. It depends on when the reactor was shut down, but the margin is very narrow in a war zone. When off-site power is lost, the operators only have hours before stored battery power runs out, after which the crucial instrumentation and control systems begin to fail.
So if the diesel generators don't kick in, or if they run out of fuel, the path toward a core meltdown accelerates very quickly.
Very quickly. And the frequency of danger, then, is the key.
It's the metric of leverage.
It is. The resources note that the plant temporarily lost all off-site power overnight in late 2025. Even in cold shutdown, that dependence on external electricity to cool nuclear material and prevent a meltdown means the threat is constant. Each disruption, like a power loss, narrows the technical margin for error, which increases the leverage of the occupying force.
And the water vulnerability tied to the Kakhovka Dam is now a permanent physical leverage point.
Absolutely. The draining of the reservoir sharply reduced the cooling water supply and forced reliance on groundwater wells on site. This water availability is a massive wartime vulnerability. Any disruption to the wells, the pipes, or the pumps can escalate a stable shutdown into an emergency, which instantly raises the stakes for negotiations. Control over the water supply is control over the safety margin.
So ZNPP matters because it represents a massive latent capacity. It's going to shape post-war reconstruction timelines, grid stability, national resilience for decades. Control over its eventual restart is inherently negotiable, even today.
Which defines the bargaining framework. The plant functions as leverage through 3 main channels, all interconnected: electricity, risk, and legitimacy. Leverage is relational. It only functions if controlling the asset alters the other side's payoff calculations, meaning it hurts them or it rewards the occupier.
Okay, let's start with the electricity leverage. How does that work?
This is all about option control. Even when it's offline, the plant remains a giant piece of potential infrastructure. The occupier controls maintenance access, transmission line repair permissions, especially for major infrastructure like the 750 kV line and future grid governance.
So by controlling these options, the occupier retains bargaining weight in any reconstruction diplomacy.
They do. They can influence where power flows and when generation resumes. They force the world to negotiate around them simply to restore long-term stability.
Risk leverage, then, seems to be the most active tool.
It is. It functions through catastrophic uncertainty. The goal is creating a threat that leaves something to chance. The fact that power has been lost at least 12 times shows that the occupier is willing to tolerate or even encourage high-risk operational instability. This instability compels localized coordination and diplomacy.
Not because the parties trust each other.
No, but because the risk of accident is too dangerous for anyone to ignore.
And finally, there's legitimacy leverage.
That operates through administration. Actions like the Russian regulator granting an operating license for a ZNPP unit are bureaucratic proxies for sovereignty claims. The occupier asserts control not just with weapons, but with paperwork.
And Ukraine's condemnation of illegal licensing then frames the contest over who has the right to govern the plant's future.
It turns a technical action into a diplomatic provocation.
Let's look closer at those three channels in action, specifically how they generate diplomatic friction.
Right.
When we talk about electricity leverage, we're talking about controlling the physical connections to the wider power grid.
Right. So consider the 750 kV line, the main transmission route. It's critical for feeding power into the plant, for cooling and safety systems. By controlling who can access and repair these lines, the occupier is controlling the short-term safety margin and the long-term recovery timeline.
They're setting the conditions for future stability.
And forcing international bodies and Ukraine to seek permission for what should be simple technical maintenance. It makes the post-war recovery timetable a negotiable political asset, even while the facility is silent.
Risk leverage is operationalized through that recurring danger. The repetition of power loss, the more than a dozen times the plant has gone dark, that's the key indicator here.
That repetition signals that the plant's safety margin is critically thin, and crucially, that the occupying forces view this instability as beneficial for their strategic position. This high-consequence uncertainty compels localized coordination.
This micro-diplomacy.
Right. The plant's immense risk profile forces both sides into these small, limited, highly technical discussions focused solely on preventing an immediate accident because the risk of a regional catastrophe overrides their strategic distrust.
And that legitimacy leverage uses administration as a silent weapon.
It's a very sophisticated form of coercion. When the Russian state regulator grants an operating license for one of the units, that is an overt assertion of sovereignty and lawful control over the facility. It attempts to normalize the occupation by framing it as a legal regulatory transfer.
Which is why Ukraine's diplomatic response, condemning the action as illegal and void, is so immediate.
It has to be. It turns that technical paperwork into a diplomatic flashpoint. This fight ensures that every technical safety discussion is perpetually entangled with claims over who has the right to govern the territory.
These competing pressures create two colliding diplomatic tracks that try to manage the crisis. The first is technical safety diplomacy, largely led by the IAEA.
This track is pragmatic, tactical, and incremental. It focuses entirely on accident prevention, using IAEA monitoring, the 7 pillars, and the 5 concrete principles. Its goal is pure stabilization, securing monitored coordination, and pauses in fighting to address urgent safety needs.
This is where that necessary, if fragile, micro-diplomacy happens.
It is, and it's driven by the shared physical danger.
The second track, strategic wartime diplomacy, is entirely political and maximalist.
This track views every single action through the lens of territory and sovereignty. It resists any step that might be interpreted as signaling recognition of the occupier's claims, whether those steps are bureaucratic, staffing rules, or concessions on access.
And the collision is constant.
It is. A technical request, say a temporary safe corridor to fix the main 750 kV power line, is immediately viewed by the opposing side as a strategic concession that could be used for intelligence or repositioning troops.
The sources do provide concrete examples of this collision being managed by sheer necessity, though. Repairs on power lines required temporary, localized ceasefires brokered by the IAEA.
Yes. The material documents that in late 2025, repairs began on critical power lines supplying ZNPP only after localized ceasefire zones were established and monitored. The IAEA Director General had to personally stress that restoring off-site power was essential for safety, and he praised the limited engagement from both sides.
So these episodes illustrate a grim reality.
They do. Mutual vulnerability. The immense shared nuclear danger can force limited cooperation even when strategic trust is completely absent. The microdiplomacy creates pauses, but it is not peace.
Finally, ZNPP has become a precedent, fight testing whether a nuclear power plant is treated as ordinary terrain or infrastructure demanding exceptional restraint.
The legal foundation for this is the international humanitarian law, specifically Additional Protocol I to the Geneva Convention's Article 56. The law basically says you cannot attack a nuclear electrical generating station, dams, or dikes if the attack is likely to cause the release of dangerous forces and consequent mass civilian losses.
It's designed to prevent war from gambling with large-scale civilian catastrophe.
It is. But the occupation strategy has completely inverted that norm.
How so?
If the plant's protective status, the fact that the enemy won't strike it, is leveraged to deter counterstrikes while military activity is conducted from adjacent positions, the norm is inverted. This strategy rewarded the very behavior the law was designed to prevent. ZNPP sets a horrifying precedent for future conflicts.
And the institutional struggle, the resolutions passed by the UN General Assembly and the IAEA Board of Governors, are attempts to combat that norm inversion.
Those non-binding resolutions are important for setting the international norm. They assert that the issue is not a bilateral dispute. It implicates international nuclear governance and global safety. They define what the world names as unacceptable, putting the moral judgment into institutional memory.
Given this collision of strategic and theological realities, the sources propose a policy rubric against which any plan to stabilize ZNPP must be judged. We have to move beyond just moral condemnation to practical, achievable policy.
This 5-point rubric is essential to avoid wishful thinking. Any policy plan has to be judged on safety, which is reducing accident probability. Verification, can compliance be reliably observed? Incentives, does it reward the coercion strategy? Energy reliability, does it preserve future capacity? And political feasibility, can it be implemented in an active war zone?
Okay, let's analyze the proposed designs against this rubric, starting with the most feasible one, enhanced monitoring and repair window protocols.
This approach just formalizes the small, incremental steps already being taken. It means formalized, temporary, localized ceasefires for critical repairs, like restoring the main 750 kV line or delivering fuel.
So it scores well on safety and feasibility because it's observable and limited, and it avoids major sovereignty concessions.
It does, but the drawback is the incentive score. It risks normalizing the routine of crisis and repair, effectively giving the occupier control over the rhythm of stabilization efforts.
Next, the more ambitious but safer plan, a verified demilitarized perimeter.
This plan involves establishing a ring around the key infrastructure. The plant itself, cooling corridors, access roads, where heavy weapons and troops are explicitly prohibited. It scores better on safety and incentives because it reduces the ability of the occupier to manufacture high-risk moments.
But the feasibility is lower.
Much lower. Verification is extremely difficult. Who inspects and what consequences follow a violation in a war zone? The plan requires concrete, repeatable monitoring routines, but without an external enforcement mechanism, it risks becoming purely symbolic.
And the high safety, lowest feasibility option, international custodianship.
This is the cleanest solution for nuclear safety. It would place the entire safety management operation under neutral, internationally backed operator and provide explicit security guarantees, bracketing any sovereignty claims. It scores highest on safety and reduces the plant's usefulness as a bargaining chip.
But politically, it's toxic.
Completely. Both sides view it as legitimizing the other's claims of future control, or worse, giving control to a third party. Without a major post-war peace settlement or a credible UN enforcement backstop, it remains entirely politically infeasible in the short term.
We began this discussion in the shadow of the Technocratic Fall, and we have to conclude by anchoring our analysis in biblical eschatology. The sources frame this crisis not just as a geopolitical event, but as a signpost.
A premillennial framework provides the necessary lens. We interpret this crisis not as a random disaster, but as birth pangs, the symptoms of the age of Gentile rule drawing to a close. The instability and human depravity we see at ZNPP confirms that the world system, operating apart from Christ, is groaning under its own sin, just as Scripture tells us in Matthew 24.
The doctrine of divine sovereignty provides the anger against the existential dread caused by the nuclear risk. We have to cling to the affirmation of Colossians 1:1 sanity. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together.
That is a statement of metaphysical reality that applies directly to ZNPP. The atomic binding forces, the very structure of the uranium nucleus, are sustained moment by moment by the word of Christ's authority.
So we have to reject any form of nuclear pacifism, which suggests that humanity possesses the autonomous ability to completely annihilate creation before God's appointed time.
We do. A disaster will occur only if divine decree permits it. Our confidence in the stability of creation is not in man's skill, but in Christ's word.
And the fact that ZNPP has not yet suffered a catastrophic meltdown, despite all the shelling, occupation, and power failures, points us to the doctrine of the catechon, the restrainer.
That is the active element of grace at work. The Holy Spirit indwelling the church is currently holding back the full tide of human evil. The precarious stability of ZNPP, its survival against all military logic and human recklessness, is a clear sign of this restraining grace in action.
if man were left entirely to his own devices.
Coupled with this technology, we would have consumed ourselves long ago.
So the Church's final posture is one of sober vigilance, recognizing that true, lasting peace, where nations shall not lift up sword against nation, is reserved for the millennial kingdom established by Christ's physical return.
We have to pray for the strength and wisdom of the engineers, and for the restraint of the wicked who would use such means for ill. Our confidence rests not in the resolutions passed in Geneva or the negotiations in New York, but in the certain return of the King, who will place the created order under the righteous dominion of the second Adam.
This deep dive has shown that ZNPP is a multi-front instrument of pressure, manipulating recovery options, catastrophe probability, and legal authority all at the same time. Secular efforts to manage this chaos are necessary and good expressions of common grace, but they are intrinsically insufficient against the moral failings of the human heart.
The crisis reveals that regulating nuclear chaos requires more than treaties. It requires the sovereign hand of God to actively maintain order in a disordered world. The instability at Zaporizhzhia is a powerful sermon. Man is too wicked to wield the power of the gods, and the earth will only find rest under the righteous dominion of Christ.
As you consider this unprecedented situation, consider what other modern technological feats, from artificial intelligence to bioengineering, might be similarly inverted and weaponized by the human heart apart from common grace and divine restraint. Think on what it means to be a steward of such immense scientific knowledge. We will see you for the next deep dive.